Rijeka is Croatia's third largest city and the country's main port. It is located on the northern tip of the Adriatic Sea, right along the Kvarner Bay. Historically, the city is probably better known under its Italian name, Fiume. By the way, both of these names just translate to river, referring to the Riecina River flowing through the city. From the 16th century until the end of the First World War, Fiume had been a part of the Habsburg monarchy with very little interruption. Its isolated position, surrounded by a range of mountains, made sure that the city wouldn't fall into Ottoman hands. Alongside Trieste, Fiume acquired the status of a free port in 1717, a step which greatly increased the city's trade volume. Almost 50 years later, Maria Theresia attached Fiume to the Crown of Hungary, but as a corpus separatum. This meant that the city and its surrounding area enjoyed a greater degree of autonomy than any other Hungarian county. The plan was to develop Hungarian agriculture and industry by promoting commerce with its products through the country's sole port. During the revolution of 1848 to 1849, Fiume became a part of the autonomous kingdom of Croatia and Slavonia. Only 20 years later did the city fall back under direct rule of the Hungarian state, again as a free city. In the late 19th century, Fiume saw a period of great migration and its population increased massively. Most of the newcomers came from the regions of Veneto and Marche on the Italian peninsula. Soon the town became a melting pot between Italian, Croatian, Slovenian, German and Hungarian culture, with Italian being the dominant language. For a long time, ethnic origins didn't seem to matter much. Instead, most inhabitants acquired a unique Fiumean identity and spoke several languages. Here's how a Hungarian travel account described it. Everywhere you hear the melodic sounds of the Italian language, mixed with the idiom of the Hungarians, Slavs and Germans, as well as the French, English and other peoples brought here by overseas traffic. The houses and palaces, built in the Italian style or showing the cheerful forms of the Renaissance in sometimes wide streets, sometimes narrow alleys reminiscent of the Levant, enclose a peculiar folk life. For a long time, Fiume got spared by the nationalistic hysteria that was befalling other parts of the Habsburg Empire. Some nationalist organizations were eventually founded, such as the Italian irredentist Giovine Fiume, but generally all the ethnic groups had good relations with one another and agreed that the city should keep its autonomous status within the centralized Kingdom of Hungary. It was only after the First World War and after the subsequent breakup of Austria-Hungary that Fiume became a symbol for ethnic rivalry and imperialist aspirations. When the Paris peace talks began, the Kingdom of Italy was in a politically precarious situation. It had emerged from the horrors of the Great War as a victor, but at what cost? Until 1918, 500,000 men had perished and the country had acquired a massive debt. And it didn't even have anything to show for it really, as its military performance was less than ideal. In Italy, a lot of people were unsatisfied with the outcome of the war, and calls for a revolution were beginning to spread. This put Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando in a position of extreme pressure. He had lost the support of the liberals and the moderate socialists, and thus had to rely increasingly on the nationalists in parliament. As such, he urgently needed to secure a good deal for Italy at the peace talks if he wanted to stay in power. At Versailles, he was accompanied by the conservative foreign minister, Sidney Sonnino, who insisted on land gains in Dalmatia, a territory which he considered to be a part of Italy's unredeemed lands. In April 1915, Italy and the Entente powers had secretly signed the Treaty of London. In exchange for joining the war against the Central Powers, Italy was to receive Trento and South Tyrol, Trieste and Istria, Dalmatia, as well as a protectorate over Albania. Sidney Sonnino had personally signed the treaty and justified it in two ways. For one, he cited ethnic reasons, as most of these territories had a sizable Italian population. And secondly, he claimed that these lands would guarantee Italy strategic security in the Mediterranean Sea. In reality, these justifications were obviously nothing more than a pretext to justify an imperialist land grab. When the peace talks began in Paris, it quickly became abundantly clear that Italy was not going to receive all the territory it had been promised in 1915. Its claims largely overlapped with those of the recently founded Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, a state friendly to the Allied powers. Furthermore, the American president Woodrow Wilson made it very clear that giving Dalmatia away to Italy would be a violation of the right to self-determination, as the majority of its inhabitants were Serbo-Croatian speakers. And finally, if Italy had really gained its desired territory, it would have become the uncontested power in the Adriatic, leaving Yugoslavia with no port and only a short coastline. The American, British and French delegates attempted to encourage both Italy and Yugoslavia to sign a mutual border agreement, and while Yugoslavia seemed more than willing to compromise, Italy remained stubborn. One day, the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, complained about the Italian delegation. That afternoon, Orlando harassed us with a lengthy lecture to explain Italy's demands and to indicate which borders it considers necessary and fair. And then we had to endure a second, no less boring speech by Sonnino. During the talks, the city of Fiume suddenly came up. Previously it hadn't been up for discussion, but now Italy was claiming this port city as well. After all, Fiume's population had been majorly Italian, and so surely the principle of self-determination would apply to it as well. Wilson took a hard stand against it, arguing that the city didn't have enough of an Italian majority and that it was completely surrounded by Serbo-Croat speakers. Soon, Fiume, this small and mostly unremarkable port city, came to symbolize the growing feeling among many Italians that Italy was getting a raw deal at the peace talks and was not considered as an equal. While Britain and France were allowed to get new colonial possessions in the Middle East and in Africa, and while Wilson seemed more than happy to violate the right for self-determination when it came to the question of South Tyrol, Austria and the Polish corridor, Italy wasn't allowed to get one small port city. Negotiations over Fiume entered a deadlock, and because of his failure, Prime Minister Orlando was voted out in June 1919, to be replaced by the US-friendly Francesco Nitti. He too got ousted just 1 year later. It was only in 1920, as a result of the Treaty of Rapallo, when the border dispute between Italy and Yugoslavia was finally resolved. Under the treaty, Fiume was to become a city-state under international supervision. But it wasn't going to be this easy. So far, we've only looked at the imperialist desires of an unstable nation-state, but what did the inhabitants of multicultural Fiume actually want? When the Great War came to an end, Fiume erupted into chaos. On the 18th of October 1918, the Fiume representative in the Hungarian parliament, Andrea Osoinak, declared the city a legally independent city-state. He based his wishes on Kaiser Karl's People Manifesto, which granted autonomy to all peoples in Austria. The other members of the parliament objected, saying that the manifesto only applied to the Austrian half of the empire and had no effect on Hungary's internal policies. Shortly after, on the 29th of October 1918, the Hungarian administration and the military formally abandoned Fiume and instead transferred control over to the newly founded National Council of Slovenes, Croats and Serbs in Zagreb. Richard Lenac, a local lawyer and Yugoslav national activist, took control over both Fiume and her sister city of Sušak. He proclaimed in both Italian and Croatian that all citizens of Fiume would enjoy equal rights and that no ethnicity would be discriminated against. To prevent Fiume from falling into Yugoslav hands, Italian nationalists formed an Italian National Council under the leadership of Antonio Grosich and demanded that Fiume finally join its Italian motherland. Almost simultaneously, a multinational workers' council was formed, which called for a citywide plebiscite. So, within the span of only a few weeks, 4 different Fiumean groups declared 4 vastly different ideas on how the port city should be run in the future. To make sure that their own interests were secured, French, Italian, British and American ships arrived at Fiume, and the city was occupied by soldiers from these 4 powers. After the arrival of the Allied troops, the Socialist Workers' Council got silenced and Richard Lenac got replaced by Antonio Grosich as Fiume's president. As such, the Italian National Council became the de facto government, and they still demanded annexation to Italy. Immediately, the Italian nationalists began a campaign to prove Fiume's Italianness. The Italian National Council opened up a press office which sent newspapers to Italy and to Italian communities worldwide. In these newspapers, they would usually write horror stories about how the Yugoslavs were planning to wipe out Italian culture, claiming that their lives were in danger. They also distributed postcards to the occupying soldiers in the hopes that they would send them far and wide, informing the world about why Fiume needed to become Italian. When the municipal elections came up in September 1919, the Italian National Council decided to give women the right to vote in order to increase their voting base. This created an interesting situation in which women were allowed to vote in tiny Fiume, but not in the two neighbouring countries of Italy and Yugoslavia. The Allied occupation didn't bring peace to Fiume. Tensions were especially high between the French and the Italian troops, with each of them considering themselves to be the protector of either Italian or Yugoslav interests. One night, two drunk French soldiers were on their way back to their barracks when they saw two young women wearing rosettes in the Italian national colours. This apparently enraged them so much that they assaulted the women, spat in their faces, tore off their rosettes and trampled on them. News spread quickly, and Italian nationalists as well as Italian soldiers banded together to take revenge. After 3 days of fighting, 67 soldiers had been wounded and 9 had died. Shortly after, an inter-allied commission determined that both the French and the Italian soldiers were not much more than a disturbance and ordered them to retreat. And on the 25th of August 1919, the last Italian occupying soldiers left Fiume, much to the dismay of the local population. Even before the departure of the Italians, a conspiracy of an armed expedition of volunteers into Fiume to proclaim the city's annexation to Italy was starting to develop. Many local leaders from the Italian National Council, such as Giovanni Horst Venturi, began to establish contact with several Arditi units in Italy. During the First World War, the Arditi had been the special units of the Italian army, and after the war was over, many of them found it difficult to integrate back into civilian life. And so many of them organized themselves into politically radical paramilitary organizations. They were the perfect candidates to carry out such an operation. And in September of 1919, with the departure of the Italian troops from Fiume, the time seemed ripe. But who should lead them? None other than a certain Gabriele D'Annunzio. D'Annunzio was a strange character. Before the war, he had been a member of the Conservative Party in the Italian parliament, and he was a talented poet as well as a writer. He had gained fame, or rather notoriety, for his charm, his opulent lifestyle, and his countless romantic affairs. But it was during the Great War, where he had fought as a soldier, that he gained nationwide fame. In August of 1918, he flew over Vienna and dropped thousands of propaganda leaflets. This was an extraordinarily adventurous and dangerous enterprise, and it earned him the admiration of his countrymen. After the war, he became sort of a prophet for the Italian nationalist cause. He held numerous speeches in front of retired war veterans or passionate listeners. He was the one who coined the phrase Vittoria mutilata, or mutilated victory, to describe Italy's land gains at the Paris Peace Conference. D'Annunzio fully supported the annexation of Fiume and denounced the Allied powers for refusing to give Italy its fair share. His popularity was at an all-time high when he received the offer to personally lead the March on Fiume. And so, on the 12th of September 1919, D'Annunzio marched into Fiume at the head of a giant column made up of more than 2,000 soldiers, a number of armoured cars and lorries, and even a few tanks. Despite having orders to stop the march on Fiume, the Italian border guards let him pass. Upon their arrival, D'Annunzio and his troops were greeted enthusiastically, and festivities immediately broke out. The Italian National Council granted D'Annunzio command of the city. His first action as leader was to step onto the balcony of the Governor Palace and to announce the annexation to Italy in front of an ecstatic crowd. He unveiled a giant Italian tricolour and once again presented himself as a sort of prophet destined to bring about the will of the Italian people. After this renewed act of will, I proclaim, I, a soldier, a volunteer, a wounded veteran of the war, believe that I interpret the will of all the people of Italy, proclaiming the annexation of Fiume. Initially, the Italian government under Prime Minister Francesco Nitti attempted to regain control. General Pietro Badoglio was ordered to set up roadblocks, cut off all the communication lines, and increase the morale of his soldiers so that they would stop deserting over to D'Annunzio's side. These measures sparked anger across Italy, and the nationalists organized protests and demonstrations against the perceived injustice against their Fiuman brethren. Even the trade unions threatened to start a general strike. In the end, the Italian government cut back on some of the measures and even sent supplies to Fiume. No one in parliament supported the annexation of Fiume out of fear from international intervention. Instead, Rome hoped for a deal with Yugoslavia to make Fiume an independent city-state. Nitti established contact with moderate politicians in the Italian National Council, urging them to oppose D'Annunzio. D'Annunzio was furious and lashed out against Nitti, calling him a coward. After 2 months' time, Nitti managed to convince the moderate members of the Italian National Council to accept a compromise, which would make Fiume a free city-state with a direct land connection to Italy. This deal was struck with Antonio Grossi and Giovanni Host Venturi, the leader of a paramilitary group, without the presence of D'Annunzio. On the 18th of December, a citywide plebiscite was held where the Fiumans could vote on their future. When it became clear that most citizens simply wanted to accept the compromise and end the uncertainty surrounding Fiume, D'Annunzio stepped in and simply stopped the vote count. Following this debacle, many of D'Annunzio's associates began to distance themselves from him, and hundreds of legionnaires left Fiume every day. With that, the Fiume government became increasingly revolutionary. The syndicalist Alceste de Ambris arrived in Fiume with some support from famous Italian socialists and anarchists such as Giuseppe Giuletti and Enrico Malatesta. After his arrival, de Ambris began writing the constitution for a Fiuman state. Too long had he and D'Annunzio been waiting for Italian annexation, but it just wouldn't happen. Instead, the city's economy was in the gutter, and its inhabitants depended on food deliveries from Italy. So they wanted to re-establish the economy by bringing about a new societal order. Both of them wanted Fiume to become this model on how to run a perfect society after the collapse of the great European empires. And so, on the 8th of September 1920, D'Annunzio announced the founding of the Italian Regency of Carnaro, with Quarnero being a reference to the Italian name for the Quarner Gulf. The state's new constitution was a weird mixture between various political ideas at the time and incorporated syndicalist, republican, and corporatist ideas. It was surprisingly progressive for its time, announcing the equality of all its citizens regardless of gender, race, or religion. It also granted everyone the right to education, healthcare, an honest wage, insurance, and even to music, which was declared to be a religious and social institution for some reason. The state was to be run by 2 elected parliamentary bodies. The first of these, the Consiglio dei Provisori, was to be elected by universal suffrage and was grouped into 9 different corporations, which were based on certain jobs and occupation groups. Its task was to take care of economic matters and all questions dealing with labour. The second parliament, the Consiglio degli Ottimi, was also directly elected by universal suffrage, with each representative being responsible for exactly 1,000 citizens. It was responsible for judicial matters, education, and the arts. Once a year, both parliaments would come together to form the Arengo del Carnaro and to discuss foreign policy, finance, and higher education. In times of emergency, a single dictator, a comandante, was supposed to take control for 6 months, similarly to the dictators in ancient Rome. D'Annunzio also snuck in a system which was supposed to indoctrinate Fiume citizens in beauty and music. He called for the creation of a college of so-called aediles, who were supposed to keep the city beautiful, organize civic festivals, and bring forward a sense of divine beauty. When it came to foreign policy, Fiume also chose a very interesting path. The leader of the Foreign Office, Leon Kochnitsky, a Belgian poet and communist, proposed the creation of what he called the League of Fiume. It was supposed to be a counterweight to the imperialist League of Nations proposed by Woodrow Wilson and unite all of the oppressed peoples on the planet. Quickly, letters of approval flocked into Fiume from Ireland, Egypt, the Islamic states, and all of the Slavic peoples in Yugoslavia, except for the Serbs. The Foreign Ministry also stressed that they supported the cause of the German and Hungarian people who suddenly found themselves in newly created post-war states. Kochnitsky was soon in contact with Indian and Irish nationalists, as well as with Soviet Russia. But unfortunately, due to a lack of funds, the League of Fiume project soon got cancelled. Only Croatian separatists would still receive some funds from the Fiume government. D'Annunzio's rule over Fiume was short-lived. He and all the other intellectuals and idealists who flocked into Fiume wouldn't get the chance to realize their envisioned utopia, because just a few months after the proclamation of the constitution, war broke out. With Italy and Yugoslavia having signed the Treaty of Rapallo in November 1920, both agreed to turn Fiume into a free city-state. D'Annunzio refused to accept it, and so Italy laid siege to Fiume in December of the same year, trying to finally force the city to accept its independence. D'Annunzio and his friends still refused to give in, and their loyal legionnaires put up a somewhat decent fight against the incoming Italian soldiers. After 3 days of bombardment, Fiume finally surrendered. The fighting stopped, and D'Annunzio was kicked out. After this debacle, D'Annunzio retreated to his villa at Lake Garda, where he would spend the rest of his life. He remained a radical nationalist, still urging for Italian territorial expansion in Africa, but for the most part he would stay out of politics and had no influence over the fascists that soon took control. He died of a stroke in 1938. Fiume became a city-state, and in April 1921 the first parliamentary elections were held. With support from the Croat population, the Autonomist Party won, and Riccardo Sanella became the first president. In March 1922, however, Italian fascists carried out a coup d'etat, and the Fiume government had to flee to Kraljevica. The Italian army once again marched in and restored order, but then handed control over to the annexationist minority in Fiume. In January of 1924, Italy and Yugoslavia signed yet another border treaty. Fiume thus became a part of Italy, while its sister city, Sušac, was annexed by Yugoslavia. For around 20 years, Fiume was part of fascist Italy, and its Croat population suffered under a policy of discrimination and Italianization. After the Second World War, Fiume was annexed by communist Yugoslavia, and most of its Italian population left the city, following a series of violence and retaliatory acts. But what was the legacy of D'Annunzio's Fiume adventure? D'Annunzio wasn't a fascist, and the Carnaro constitution had very little in common with the totalitarian regime of Mussolini. Fiume attracted a wide array of idealists and political thinkers, from nationalists to anarchists and from syndicalists to militarists. They attempted to build up a weird utopian corporatist state which was supposed to bridge the gap between the workers and the state. They granted the Fiumans many rights that people in other countries could only dream of, such as complete gender equality, legalization of homosexuality, religious freedom, right to a fair wage, and many more. Still, Mussolini learned a lot from D'Annunzio. He came to adopt the lively balcony speeches, the Roman salute, the Arditi black shirts, the mass rallies, and the elaborate system of chants and symbols. The March on Fiume was a direct inspiration for the March on Rome, soon after Mussolini was appointed as Prime Minister of Italy. D'Annunzio knew how to captivate and to mobilize people, and he laid the groundwork for the fascist style that we know today. Fiume also showed the weakness and instability of the Italian government, who seemed to be completely unable to achieve a good deal for Italy at the Paris Peace Conference, and subsequently betrayed the Fiuman people in the eyes of many Italian nationalists. D'Annunzio's Fiume wasn't a reflection of Mussolini's Italy, but it undeniably characterized its aesthetics and tactics. With this complex legacy, D'Annunzio left a lasting impact on the Italian political landscape, bridging the gap between idealism and authoritarianism, and setting the stage for the rise of fascism in his own way. Anyway, that's all for today. As always, dankeschön for watching, and I hope you learned something useful. If you did, a like and a subscribe would, of course, be much appreciated. I would also like to give a huge and heartfelt shout out to my kind supporters over on Ko-Fi: A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Philipp Marchewka, Marius Gerling, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drohle, Wienweh, and Pseudoriser. You are bloody lovely. Have a very nice day, and see you next time.